Today's daf is daf tzadi, and in order to ease into today's daf, let's repeat what we learned in a brisa on daf peites amid beis. The brisa says that if someone purchases a lamb for the Korban Pesach and he wants to sell off segments, the monies that are paid to him are chulin, so that when the buyer pays the mamuna for his segment that he wants to buy into the Korban Pesach, the money's in the hands of the mamuna, now are chulin. And the Gemara raised the following problem: how could that be? If the monies were designated by the buyer up front for purchasing a Korban Pesach, they have the status of hegdesh. And if they have a status as hegdesh, in order to go to chulin, you need a chilul, and the chilul has to be onto something that's chulin. So you have to take kodesh and you mechal it on chulin. But he's being mechal it on what? On the Korban Pesach? Korban Pesach itself is hegdesh. So we're now on the top of Daf Tzadi. Omar Abaye. And this is going to start the daf for today. Omar Abaye. Ilav di ukme Rabbi Oshia lahi, if not for the fact that Rav Oshia interpreted a Mishnah in Tmura as a case of bimemane zona al pischo, where a person has a relationship with the zona, and when he hires her, he designates a Korban Pesach for his payment to the zona. Normally, when you designate something as payment to a zona, if it's an animal that's royal in mizbeach, it now becomes posel in mizbeach. That's called esnan zona, and you're not allowed to bring it on the mizbeach. But according to the way Rav Oshia understood that Mishnah, the Mishnah is Rebbehi. In other words, we're talking about a case where he gave as payment to hire the zona a lamb that was designated as a Korban Pesach. And Rav Oshia holds that the reason, according to Rebbe, that this could be an Esnan Zona, the Gemara actually, as we'll soon see, is going to bring a pasuk to teach us that it does not have the status of Esnan Zona, but otherwise it would have the status of Esnan Zona. And the reason for that is because, says Rabbi Oshia, in explaining Rebbe, that Korban Pesach is mamon bailim, that when a person is magdish the Korban Pesach, he is what we call mishayer b'kedushasa. He limits the kedusha of the Pesach. And since he is not magdish with a hegdesh gomor, and he still retains for himself part ownership of the Korban Pesach, therefore he can create what's called an esnan zona. And Abai says that if not for this interpretation of Rabbi Oshia of the Mishnah in Tmura, I would have interpreted the Mishnah in Tmura as reflecting not the sheet of Rebbe, but rather, and not referring to a case where he designated a Korban Pesach and then gave it as hire to a zona, but rather b'chol kodshim kalim. We weren't discussing Korban Pesach particularly, where Rebbe says that, according to Rabbi Oshia, that a Korban Pesach is not, the Bailim are not magdish the Korban completely. They leave a shiur, they leave a certain amount of ownership in the Pesach. But rather, I would have insisted, says Abaye, that Mishnah of Esnan Zona in Tmura is referring to Kodshim Kalim. I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Dharma Kodshim Kalim, Moment Bailim. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, since in Kodshim Kalim the Bailim have rights to eat the bus, or therefore the Kodshim belong to them. They have private ownership over the Kodshim. For example, Rabbi Yossi Aglili might say that if a person destroys somebody's Kodshim Kalim, and you have to pay the Bailim. Or, for example, if a person took Kodshim Kalim and he gave it as a as Kesef Kedushin, it would be valid. This is called Mamon Bailim. You have personal, private ownership over Kodshim Kalan. And therefore, if he gave Kodshim Kalan to a Zona as hire, as payment, therefore, it becomes an Esnan Zona. And I'm going to avoid Rabbi Yochia, says Abai. And I'm going to assume Avol Bepesach, Lo Mishayer Inish. I will disagree with Rabbi Oshia. And in the case of a person who is Magdish a carbon as a Pesach, he has no holds barred. There's no shear. He doesn't hold back in any way. He's Magdish at Hegdesh Gamur. And if that be the case, then we would say that he cannot give it as Esnan Zona and generate an Isser or Psul of Esnan Zona because it's not his to do so. And in order to explain the Mishnah of Esnan Zona, we're going to have to introduce Rabbi Yossi Aglili in Kodshim Kalan. Now, in the case that we discussed, where a person who buys a Korban Pesach sells off his portions, and the money that's being paid to him for those various portions is chulin, the most vadai mishayer inish. Here I would agree that there's halach of shir, not on the part of the magdish, the one who designated and was magdish this set as a korban pesach, but rather on the part of the buyer who designated mos, and he singled out that these monies would be used to buy a korban pesach. Here he's mishayer. And what does that mean? He's Mishayah to make Koraki Mafrich Lahu when he designated this money to purchase a segment, a portion of the Korban Pesach. Adaiti the Hachi Mafrich Lahu. His das was that I'm only being mafreshit on the condition that when I pay it as purchase money for my chelik in the Korban Pesach, it should become chulin in the hands of the seller. The seller would now receive payment, and that payment, those modes, are chulin. Veha, and the brisa that we quoted as sugya, that where the Bala Pesach sells off a portion of the Mosachulin, Rebbe he, that could reflect the sheet of Rebbe. We'll see later on where and what Rebbe said. And the reason why the mos, when they're paid from the buyer to the seller, are in the hands of the seller chulin is because the mos vade mishayer inish. When, let's say, Shimon was the one who bought a portion from the seller Reuven, when Shimon designated these mos to buy a portion of the Korban Pesach, he did so with a shear. Shear means he limited it, and he said, "I don't want this to be a full-fledged hegdesh. I want these mos to become chulin the very moment I use them to buy a chelik in the Korban Pesach," and therefore, when the monies are transferred over to the hands of the seller, at that moment in time, they become chulin. V'ahidikam mukile Rabbi Oshia kirebi, and in that Mishnah in Tmura, which according to Rabbi Oshia should be attributed to Rebbe, lo mukmini le'ano kirebi. I don't have the luxury, says Abai, to insist that we can interpret that Mishnah in Tmura according to Rebbe, and say that Rebbe holds that there's a shear when a person is Magdish Korban Pesach, he holds back and he retains certain ownership on the Pesach, because the Pesach lo mishayer inish. Abai's opinion against Rav Ochia is that when a person is Magdish a Sefer Korban Pesach, he does so without any limitations, and the set is completely a hegdesh. It's owned by the Bailim, and therefore there's no havamina that a person could generate an iser of the Esnan Zona on a Korban Pesach, because Korban Pesach belongs to hegdesh, belongs to Gavoa. Who are you to take something that belongs to Gavoa, give it to a Zona, and call it an Esnan Zona? Some have the girsi here, but most Meshayar Inish to make Karki Mafrishlu Adaiti the Hachi Mafarshlu, which is more or less a repeat of what we said. And therefore the Mishnah in Tmura of Esnan Zona, says Abai, would have to be interpreted in the light of Rabbi Yotzei Aglili, who holds that Kachi kachim kalim on moment bailu veha. And once again, the brisa that establishes that if you purchase a chelik in the Korban Pesach from the seller, the money's as transferred over to the hands of the seller are chulin. I cannot interpret that brisa is attributed to the authorship of Rav Yossi Aglili. The Tani Bey in the Sefer, that very same brisa, it says, "Hamocher olaso shlamav lo asav lo klum." If a person designates a carbon as either ola or shlamim for his kapara, and then he sells it on the market, that sale is totally invalid. That's what it says in the brisa. Why? Because the moment of magdish and behema zevach as shlamim or ola, it's now moment hegdish. It belongs to hegdish. I can't possibly sell something that doesn't belong to me. And that would be against Rabbi Yossi Aglili, because the word shlamim is kodshim kalim, which according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili is moment bailim, and you have private ownership on it. Therefore, you could sell the carbon and let someone else bring the carbon after he buys it. Now Abai completes his presentation. He says, "V'hashta de ukmei Rav Oshi alahi." Now that Rav Oshi has interpreted the Mishnah in Tmura b'mamane zon al pischa as a reference to a scenario in which a man hires a zona and he gives him for payment a Korban Pesach, is the Rebbe, and it reflects the sheet of Rebbe, then Shma Mino, I have to derive the conclusion, the Svirale, that according to Rav Oshia, within the context of Rebbe, Afilu Pischa Mishayir Inish, that when a person is Magdash and Korban Pesach, he is Mishayir, he's not Magdash completely Legamre, and therefore he allows other people to enter into the partnership of this Korban Pesach by buying a chelik in the Korban Pesach. How is the mocher able to sell a Korban Pesach? And the answer is that when the mocher purchased the Korban Pesach and he designated it as a Korban Pesach, he was Mishayir. He left over part, so to speak, leaving himself ownership over the Korban Pesach, such that now he can sell his chelik in the Korban Pesach. And that's a bona fide sale. And the kedushas hamos of the lokeach, of the buyer, will now be transferred over to the Korban Pesach, which has an element of chulin in it because it's not hegdish gomer as a result of shir. So let's just now summarize. There are two nafkaminas lahalacha to Rav Oshia's approach, that when a person is magdish and Korban Pesach, he's not interested in being magdish and hegdish gomer. First nafkamina is that if he takes the Korban Pesach and he gives it to a zona, it now should generate the Isser of Esnan zona because he owns his chelik in the Korban Pesach. Secondly, it means he can sell off his part of or one of the parts of the Korban Pesach to a buyer, and the buyer will give him mos. Those mos are mos chulin. The person who designated those mos for purchase purposes, meaning Shimon, who said, I'm going to use this money to buy a Korban Pesach, and therefore the money is hegdish. How does it become chulin? And the answer is, it becomes chulin through the process of chilul when we transfer the kedusha from the mos over to the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is already kadosh. The answer is, says Rav Oshia, that he wasn't magdish a hegdish gomer, and he leaves room for chulin so that now the mos can be transferred, and the kedusha mos can be transferred over to the Pesach. Now the Gemara says, "Maihi de Rabbi Oshia." Where is the statement of Rabbi Oshia? In what context did he make this statement? It's not. We have a Mishnah in Masechet Tmura, Nasan Law. A man goes to a zona and he gives her an animal or a bird, some sort of living creature that could be brought on his back. Mukdashim, and if he gives her an animal that's already been designated and consecrated as Kedushas Mizbeach, the Esnona, he gave it to her as hire. Harei Elu Mutarim, he's allowed to take that animal and be makriv on the Mizbeach. There's no Iser Esnan Zona that's chal on this Behemas Zeva. However, Ofos Dechulin, if he gave her birds, which could be brought on the Mizbeach, for example, Torim, Shnei B'nai Yonah, and they were chulin. Right now, he wasn't Magdish, so he has 100% ownership over it, is Harei Elu Asura. Now you impose upon these birds a psul of Esnan Zona, and they cannot be brought on the Mizbeach. And now the Mishnah explains, Shahaya B'din, logically, based on a Kal Vachomer, we would have concluded that the Ophos likewise would be mutter l'mizbeach, and there's no psul of Estan Zona, based on the following Kal Vachomer. Uma im mukdashim. If you have a behema that was already designated for the Mizbeach, it's already Kodesh l'mizbeach, and look how chomer it is. Shahamum posel b'hem. If after he was magdish l'mizbeach, a blemish fell on the animal, it's posel l'mizbeach. And nevertheless, ein esnan u'mechir kelev alalem. You cannot generate a psul l'mizbeach of esnan on something that lends itself to a psul of mum, and yet paradoxically there's no psul of esnan. Is ophos. Now the law of ophos is, again, it was mentioned before, Torah and Shnei B'nai Yonah, those ophos have no psul mum. There's no psul mum in ophos. It doesn't exist. And ophos, she'ein mum posel b'hem, how much more difficult it is to get a mum on ophos. That's the cool of ophos. Is eino din, how much more so she'eino on esnan and mechir kelev aleim, chal aleim, there would be no chalos psul of esnan. If there's no psul on esnan to behemas kodshim, a zevach, which lends itself to the psul of mum, but there's no psul of esnan, how much more so in the case of ophos, where there is no such thing as a psul of bal mum, certainly there would be no psul of esnan. Talmud Lomar, says the Mishnah, but on this we have a pasuk. The pasuk says in Parshas Ki Teitzei, Lo savi esnan zona v'chir kelev l'chol neder. And the extra word kol is coming as a ribui, l'rabos esa ophos, to include ophos in the iser of esnan. So when he designates a turtle dove as payment as higher for the esnan, that turtle dove now henceforth is disqualified for the mizbeach under the law of esnan, and that's derived from the extra word kol, where it says l'chol neder. Now the Brisa asks the following question. Now that you've established, based on the extra ribu, the word kol neder, that in an oath that's chulin, there will be a chal shem esna. Now we have a kal v'chomer to mukdashim. Now we should say ma ophos she'ein hamum posel b'hem esna mechir chal aleim. If something which doesn't lend itself, like an oath, to a psul of mum, and yet the psul of esnan is chal is mukdashim, which are more chamur. Shamum posel b'hem einu din. How much more so esnan mechir chal aleim? Talmud lomar lechol neder. Now we have a mute. Before we had a ribui from the word kol to be marbe ophos, and now we have a mute from the word neder. Neder means prat lin nodur. And what's a nodur? Nodur is something that, as a result of your declaration, there was a chalos hegnesh, a chalos isa. You were magdish the karban. That's called a nodur. And the Torah says neder to exclude nodur. So now the Gemara asks the kasha, Ella taima de kosa rachmana neder. You only established that there's no psul of esnan chal on mukdashim, famous mukdashim, based on a separate yalfusa, a derivation from the word neder v'lo nodur. Halafach, if you hadn't had this drasha, this mute, then havamin, I would have assumed that mukdashim chal isar aleim, chal isar esnan aleim. How could that be? But them also dover she'eno shalo. I can't create an isar on you, like the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah. If, let's say, Reuven would bow down to Shimon's animal as a deity, and that would normally generate an isar Avodah Zarah. You can't generate an isar Avodah Zarah on someone else's animal. It's not yours to generate an isar. You can isar yourself, your own possession. It's not someone else's. So now a person was Magdish Zeva. Is there a Havamina that it could become also under the law of Zona because he designated as payment for the Zona? Ain't Odom Oser Dover Shayna Shalom. It's not his, it belongs to Hegdish. Rav Oshi says, V'mamana Zona al Pischo, V'Revihi. And we'll soon see who Rebbe is, where Rebbe comes from here. But in any way, we're talking about a person who purchased a carbon Pesach with the intention of selling off its various parts. And in such a case, he is not Makdish in a Hegdesh Gomur, so we don't apply the principle of Momen Gavor. He retains private ownership over the carbon Pesach, such that now he can give it to a Zona and he can generate an Isur of Esnan. But now we have the Pasuk Neder V'lo Nadur, and therefore we have an exclusion, and there's no Esnan in the case of a carbon Pesach. My Rebbe, where do we find that Rebbe says that Pesach is Momen Bailu? The Sanya we learned in a Brisa, with regard to carbon Pesach, in Parshas Bo, it says, V'im yima'at habayis mehiyotz miseh, v'lakachu u'shcheno akarov el beiso. And we're going to darshan the pasuk in the following way. Im yima'at mibayis mehiyotz miseh. In other words, yima'at bayis means that he doesn't have funds. He doesn't have enough ample money for the purpose of the set. In other words, to buy whatever he needs for the carbon Pesach. Is then hachyehu miseh, which means that we're going to give you, hachyehu means to support someone, we're going to support you and give you the monies that you need for the purpose of the carbon Pesach from the carbon Pesach itself, which means that you could sell your portion of the carbon, or one portion of the carbon Pesach on the open market, and the monies that'll come in, you can use litzorech haseh. That's called hachyehu miseh. Bichdei achila, which means whatever you need for the purpose of eating achila of the carbon Pesach. For example, let's say you need fuel and you have to buy logs in order to roast the carbon Pesach. You don't have the money to do so. You'll sell the carbon Pesach, parts of the carbon Pesach, and the monies that will accrue to you as money that's transferred to you, buy as purchase money, you'll use that money to buy fuel in order to heat up your oven so that you can roast the carbon Pesach. But we're not going to allow you to sell the carbon Pesach on the market and take the money and use it for some sort of business venture, even though you're poor and our heart goes out for you, we have compassion, and you need money to invest, but you can't invest money that you gain from a carbon Pesach. And that's the sheet of the Chacham. What the Brisa records, the dissenting view of Rebbe. Rebbe Omer, Af Michte Mekach. Even if he wants to take these monies that he received for sale of the Korban Pesach, and he wants to use it to invest in the stock market, he can do so. If he has no mos, Mimana Acher Imal Pischo al Chagigoso, he can sell parts of his Korban Pesach. Umoshe biyadma, the money that's paid him is chulin. It's completely chulin. And this last line is really what Rav Oshi has been saying over and over again in the Gemara. Al Manas Kain, this was the original das of a person when he purchased the Korban Pesach and designated this set as a carbon. He had in mind that he should retain ownership such that now he can sell off portions and use that money to invest in the stock market. Now, regarding this machlokas between the Chacham, the Tanakama, and Rebbe, we have another machlokas how to interpret this machlokas between Rabbah and Reb Zera. Chad Omar, according to one opinion, be eitzim litzliyaso kuliyamalo pligi. Everybody agrees that if he sells off the carbon Pesach, the monies that accrue to him he could use to buy fuel, to buy eitzim for his tanur, for his oven, gave it the takanta de Pesachu, kigufa de Pesach domi. Since this is necessary in order to roast the carbon Pesach, it's considered like it's part of the mitzvah of the carbon Pesach. And therefore, everybody, even the Tanakam, would agree in such a case, he's allowed to take the funds that he receives and invest them in buying fuel to burn his oven, to fire up his oven. What's the machlokas? B'matzah umoro. Are you allowed to use these modes that were given to you for the Korban Pesach for buying matzah and moro? is Rabbanan Sabri going to Tanakama. This case of matzah and moror, achilach riti has nothing to do with the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. It's a separate mitzvah. You have to eat matzah, you have to eat moror, but we're not going to allow you to take funds that were allotted for the Korban Pesach and use them for another mitzvah. And Rebbe Sovar, Kiva de Chshero de Pesachu, Kigufa de Pesach Domi, that there is a relationship between the mitzvah of matzah and moror on the one hand and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. It's all part of one entity. In the matzah moror is a hechsher, it's to set up the Korban Pesach. Chad Omar, according to another sheet in them Aroim, the matzah moror nami kuli amaloptagi. Even the Rabbanan would agree that he could take the monies that accrued to him in the sale of the Korban Pesach and use them to buy matzah moror. Nobody disagrees with that. The Tziv, the Torah says in Parashat Malos, it says al matzos umarorin yochlu, which means that we eat the matzah and the moror together with the Pesach, all in one. In fact, Hill used to make a sandwich. In any event, you see that Keva the Machshir the Pesach, the Nukim Pesach Domi, the Torah itself requires that the matzah and the moror accompany the Korban Pesach, and therefore, for sure, it's considered within the realm of the monies of a Pesach. He pligi wears the machlokas likapo chaluk likapo talis. He wants to buy a cloak or he wants to buy a talis, a garment. Rabbanan Savri mihiyos miseh amrachmona hachyeu l'seh. The Torah says that you can use those monies if you need them in order to be mechayah the seh, meaning the seh here represents the Korban Pesach. Anything that's called tzarchei Pesach, you can use the money. But Rebbe Sova, but Rebbe holds hachyei atzmecha miseh. Whatever you need to live, to bring in support for yourself, you can do so through the seh by selling off portions of the Korban Pesach. The Gemara asks the question, Abaye di Omar, the Ilav, the Ukmar of Ochia Bahi, Bimane Zivcha Pischa, Zonal Pischa, Verebi Avimukminale, Bechol Kachim Kama, Libler of Yosef Gleam, Yom Kachim Kama Moment Bailamu, Aval the Pesach Lo Meshayar Inish. How is Abaye, who holds that in Pesach, it's crystal clear that you're Magdish the entire Pesach, and this Mishnah in Tmura is going to be Rabbi Yotzai Glili and Kachim Kalin. What is he going to do with this brisa that we just quoted? The brisa says, in explaining Rebbe Shita why he could use the damim of the Pesach for his own purposes, it says, Yisrael es Pischein, that they put a limit in their original Hegdesh when they were Magdish the Korban Pesach. So by now is going to change the text of the brisa. Ema, the way we should read this brisa is Almanas Kain Hikdishu Yisrael Moos Pischehem, not Pischehem, but Moos Pischehem, meaning we're not talking about the seller, we're talking about the buyer. When the buyer designated his Moos to purchase his chelik in the Korban Pesach, he did so with a shiur, and he left it as his own Moos, such that now when he gives them over to the mocher, it becomes moschu. And now we're up to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Omen Aleph. Now, by way of introduction to this Mishnah, we'll say the following, that a Pesach, if it's brought for Tmeim, is possible, because they can't eat it. And the Torah says, each lefi ochlo tachusal aseh. And if at the time of the Shchitas HaKarban, the Pesach, which shechted on behalf of Tmeim, it's possible. Now, we go on to introduction number 2. There's Re'iyas Ziva, and a person who has 2 Re'iyos of a Zav is Tameh until he waits 7 days of purity, where he doesn't see any Ziva. On the 7th day, of somebody who's Rosh Shtei Re'iyos, he is Tovel in a mikvah, and then after sunset, going into the 8th day, he becomes tar, and he's allowed to eat kodsh. However, if he sees 3 re'iyos of a zav, then he has to bring karbanos on the 8th day, and he's called a mechusa kapar. He cannot eat kodshim until he brings his kapar. Only after he brings his kapar is he allowed to eat kodshim. He's still, to some extent, Tame. And now we're going to learn the Mishnah. Zav Charosh Te Re'ios. So we're up to the seventh day. He has not seen any Re'ios during the 7-day period. Is Shochtim Olav B'Yom HaShvi. Now, Yom HaShvi is 7th day of Ziva, coincides with the 14th of Nisan. We're going to check the Korban Pesach on behalf of the Zav on the 7th day. And why is that? Because even though he has to wait till the sun sets at the end of this day in order to be tar, but nevertheless, at the time of the Shechita, he's not allowed to eat kachim, obviously. But we know that by Erev, by nightfall, when there's a mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach, by then it'll be tar. So we can bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf. But however, if Rosh Shalosh, if he saw 3 re'iyos of a zav, then Shochten Olav B'Yom HaShmini, then we have to wait until the 8th day. And if the 8th day coincides with Yudalid Ben Nitzan, then and only then can we check the Korban Pesach on his behalf, because on that 8th day, he will in fact bring his kapara, his carbon, to purify himself from Ziva, and he'll be able to eat the kachim on that night. So the shift here between Shtei Rios and Sholosh Rios is the shift between the 7th day and the 8th day. Now, as far as the Nida is concerned, she will be Tmeah for 7 days from the beginning of her Re'iyah. And only after the 7th day, she can be Toveles and become Tahora Labaila. Now, following the period of Nidus, there's an 11-day period of time of Ziva, Yemei Ziva. And during those days of Yemei Ziva, if she sees once, she's Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom. If she sees another time again Shomeres. If she sees 3 days consecutively, she becomes a Zava Gedola. And once again, she needs 7 Nikiyim. And then after the mikvah, the following day, on the 8th day, she'll bring her carbon, and then she's allowed to eat kosher. And Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom, in the case of a woman who sees a Re'iyah of Dam during the 11-day period, and she saw 1 Re'iyah, she'll have to wait another day, and she'll be Shomeres that day. And Shochten Olev, B'Sheni Shalom. We can bring the Korban Pesach on her behalf on the 2nd day, because assuming she doesn't see anything during that day, then she becomes Tahora with nightfall. Rasa Shnei Yom Shochten Olev B'Shlishi. If she sees on days 1 and 2, then if day 3 is the Yudalit is Erev Pesach, then we can check the Korban Pesach on day 3. And we can assume and hope that she won't have a 3rd Ziva, a 3rd Re'iyah, and she'll become Tahora at night, she'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach. But if she had 3 Re'iyos on 3 consecutive days during the Yud Aleph Yom, the 11 days of Ziva, then in such a case, she'll need to bring her carbon to become Torah, and that's on the 8th day. Is then Shochten Olev B'Shmini. You have to wait until she's passed the 7th day into the 8th day, and then, if the 8th day is Erev Pesach, then and only then can we bring the Korban Pesach on her behalf, because on that day she'll bring her carbon, she will no longer be Mechus Kapara, and she will be able to eat the Korban